Welcome and good afternoon. I'm Beth Richardson. I chair the business department at University of New England, and I'd like to welcome you to the 7th annual P.D. Merrill Business Ethics Lecture. This lecture series is a tribute to and a reminder of the importance that the late P.D. Merrill placed on the importance of identifying and wrestling with complex business issues and how those ethics impact the rest of the business community and the community at large. So we're thrilled to have all of you here and to be dealing with and listening about some very important issues. As you can see by the audience, we have a lot of students here. We have UNE business students. We have UNE students from other disciplines. We have a group from Macaulay High School. Where are you, ladies? Right there. Welcome to Macaulay High School. I'll have recruitment information for you afterwards. Our UNE senior business majors enjoyed a lunch and conversation with our guest speaker today for an hour and a half where they had a chance to prove to him that they had indeed read his book. And they did a very good job at that and asked some really tough and insightful questions, so we were very proud of them. That type of engagement, I think, is representative of the hands-on learning that we find of great importance in the business curriculum. Okay, some logistics before we get started. During the question and answer period, if you could raise your hand for a microphone and then wait until you get the mic before you ask the question, that would be terrific. After the lecture, if you could join the speaker and his family and the rest of us at the art gallery, which is all the way back, for conversation with friends and new acquaintances and with our speaker and his family, for delicious food, perhaps a glass of wine, and a chance to see the current exhibition in the gallery. And last of all, if you could please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I would very much appreciate that. Thank you. One very special thank you to the faculty member who coordinates this entire lecture series from beginning to end. Dr. Michael Daly, who's in the back, wave Michael, is not only a truly gifted economist, but an event planner extraordinaire. So that needs to go on the CV, Michael. Let me now introduce the provost of the University of New England, Dr. James Coble.
Thank you. I've always appreciated when people applaud before I say anything. It saves trouble later in case you don't like what I say. It's great to be here today. I want to welcome everyone on behalf of all of us here at the University of New England, in particular our president, Danielle Rippich, who is attending an event in Baltimore to support some of our faculty and students who are also being recognized there. We're really here. I think this event it reminds us to remember to celebrate the integrity, the values, and the principles of our dear friend and past trustee, the late P.D. Merrill, whose name is on this lecture series. I want to first recognize Sandy Goulden, P.D.'s wife, and a longtime, very dedicated member of our Board of Trustees. Their son, Ethan, who I will invite up later to give a 10-minute talk. You didn't know that, did you? He's thinking, is he kidding me? And I want to recognize all of our UNE board members who are here today. I've seen several of them in the room. As many of you know, it was Sandy's vision and support that established the inaugural lecture series in 2008 to honor PD, and she continues to provide guidance for this important annual event. We're grateful to Sandy and to all the members of the Merrill family. I'd also like to recognize the P.D. Merrill Lecture Committee. One of their many duties is to select a speaker for this series, and I guarantee you that you will find they have done another excellent job in making this year's selection. I'd also like to welcome the UNE community, our administrators, our faculty, our staff and students, and in particular our graduating business majors. As society's next generation of leaders, it's important to remember that the values you integrate daily into your decision-making influence not just your lives, but the lives of all of those you interact with. PD lived the ideals we celebrate today that the University of New England continues to believe in, and which we all strive to live by each and every day, a commitment to civic responsibility and respect for people and the diversity of ideas. And having met our speaker today, I think there's probably not a better person right now to talk about the issue of diversity of ideas than Eli Pariser. He's an author and online organizer, co-founder of Upworthy, a startup focused on making content that matters go viral. Upworthy's mission is clear: to bring massive amounts of attention to the most important topics in the world. And Upworthy is doing it well. The median post of last year's top 100 was viewed more than 3 million times and shared more than 425,000 times. In all of 2013, 139 posts on Upworthy were viewed more than 1 million times. That's real influence. During Eli's time at MoveOn.org from 2001 to 2008, the organization grew tenfold and collected nearly $120 million in small donations, which I believe gave a voice to a lot of maybe little people who might not have had a voice otherwise. Oh, no, by the way, Eli was 21 years old in 2001 when he joined MoveOn. So we've just outed him. You can figure out how old he is now. Eli also helped start Avaaz.org, a global online movement with over 24 million members in every country on earth. He has served on the boards of the Open Society Foundation's U.S. programs, the New Organizing Institute, Avaaz, MoveOn, Access, and a number of other organizations. His book, The Filter Bubble: What the Internet is Hiding from You, is a New York Times bestseller, and his TED Talk on the same topic has been seen over 2 million times and was called one of the top talks of the year by TED curator Chris Anderson. I'm actually reading Eli's book. I haven't finished it, so I don't know how it ends, but I think it's an extremely interesting and very thought-provoking book. But I have to tell you, I think it's also a little bit scary if you read it. I've always believed that in order for you to grow as a person, you needed to be exposed to different perspectives and experiences, to be open to new ideas, and in particular, to interact with people who disagree with you. I think that's a good thing to do. But according to Eli, the new generation of internet filters looks at things you seem to like and tries to extrapolate. He says, the internet is showing us things it thinks we want to see, not what we need to see. And I'm sure he'll elaborate on that theme during his talk. So although Eli now lives in Brooklyn, New York, he's a Maine who grew up in Lincolnville. And I understand he received an honorary high school diploma. My guess is that he was too far ahead of the game for high school, that they couldn't keep up with him. But one of very few that was given to non-high school graduates. He received this from Camden Rockport High School. He attended Bard College at Simon's Rock, where he graduated summa cum laude with a degree in law, politics, and society. Please join me in welcoming Eli Pariser, who will speak today about mission-driven innovation. Can technology change the world?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be here. I want to thank to the PD Merrill family, Sandy and Ethan, who are here. I want to thank the committee that selected me, and especially Mary Herman. I'll try to make sure that it was a good selection, and the University of New England for bringing me here. When I was asked to talk about business ethics, I spent a couple days thinking about what I had to say about this. Initially I was thinking about sort of moral decision making, and I was thinking about the, someone kind of weighing different complicated business decisions. Should I hire folks? Should I fire folks? There are thoughts that I have on all of that, but it didn't seem to be something that I have any special knowledge about. But as I thought about it, I realized that there was something that kind of I've been thinking about for a long time that threads through a lot of the experiences that I've had and the work that I've done that I think is worth saying. And essentially what I want to suggest today is that ethics, and ethics especially in a business context, are structural. That it's about how you put together systems of people as much as any one person making a good decision that's important when you think about business ethics. And that that's especially true as we move into a more technologically mediated era, that thinking about how the structures we create affect all of the ethical decisions that happen within them is as important as thinking about these particular moral decisions that we might make. So I've spent the last 4 years watching how this plays out, and I want to talk a bit about sort of what I've seen in each of my experiences as an activist, as an author, and now as someone running a startup. How structure plays into the ethical decisions that we make and why I think it's so important. But let me actually just tell you a little bit about how I got into all of this, because I think it's really the experience of this last 14 years that's helped inform this perspective. So shortly after I graduated college in 2000, I was working at a small nonprofit in the Boston area. And I didn't totally know what I wanted to do with my life. I knew I wanted to do something that would be some socially useful in some way, but I didn't know what it was going to be. And so since I had kind of grown up playing with computers and messing with technology, I became the IT guy at this nonprofit sort of by default. And that's where I was when the attacks on 9/11 happened. And like everyone, I was shocked, I was taken aback. I went home and remember sitting on the couch, watching the loop of the planes and the buildings. And I think, part of how I've been raised and just part of my natural instinct in those kinds of moments is to want to do something. And so first I called my friends in New York, and thankfully they were all okay. I called the local blood bank, but they had enough blood. People were kind of coming down all the time to do that. I remember the president was on TV urging people to go shopping. I don't know if folks remember this, but that was kind of a thing. And I didn't really feel like shopping. And it occurred to me that this was kind of one of those big moments in history where things can go in very different directions. And that you could imagine that it was a moment in which people came together and saw a common threat, and across a whole bunch of different countries work together to deal with that threat. Or you could imagine that it was a moment that led to unilateralism and even maybe demagoguery. And so because I was sitting at my computer thinking, like, what can I do about this? And someone sent me an online petition that was calling for a multilateral response to the attacks, basically, trying to urge the leaders of the world to come together around that multilateral vision. And I thought, okay, I know web stuff. I'm going to put this up on a website and send it on to my friends and family, and hopefully that'll do something. So I did that, and this was back in the ages. I know for some of the folks here, this is like literally before you were born, but it used to be that days would go past and you wouldn't check your email. And so that's what happened. I put this thing up. It was, I think, Wednesday after 9/11. And a few days passed. And the next Monday, I woke up, and I remember I was in my pajamas, and I went to my computer and dialed up, and remember that? And I remember, there was a little download bar, and it said, you have 20 messages left to download. And I thought, ooh, 20 messages. I don't usually get 20 messages. And then the bar started going backwards, and it said you had 400 messages to download. You have 2,000 messages to download. You have 6,000 messages to download. And I was thinking, I do not understand what's going on. So then, then the phone rang, and it was my friend Brian who had hosted this website. And he said, Eli, where are all these people coming from? The site's going down. And I said, I have no idea. I think it must be like a hacking attempt or something like this. So, I hang up the phone and I go, this is really weird. So then I look at the petition, and 50,000 people have signed this thing from 53 countries all over the world. And as that's kind of sinking in, the phone rings again, and it's a British voice on the other end of the phone. And I won't do the accent, but they say, "Hello, this is the BBC calling. We'd like to speak to the president of this website." And I'm sitting there in my pajamas, 20 years old, and I say, hold on for a second, I'll see what I can do. I'll see if I can find him. And, so it was this amazing thing, and it spread through word of mouth. And over the next two weeks, over 500,000 people signed on to this website. And that's really kind of how I got started thinking about technology and politics. It's sort of an accident in a way, that group of people, where it really got scary actually was a couple days later. I started getting these emails saying like, "So what are we going to do next?" and I was saying like, no, there's no next. It's just a one-time thing. Who's we? Who's next? Like, I'm back to my job. But people wanted to do more stuff, and so I felt like, okay, well, now I've got to help people do more stuff. And so, during that time, I started to make contact with MoveOn. We ended up merging those two groups, and that's really kind of how my whole career here started. So the thing I take away from that experience is that, as we'll talk about, I think there are a lot of challenges with the way that the internet has developed. I think that it is not necessarily the case that it is going to deliver us from all of our problems. But I do think it's pretty amazing as a 20-year-old with no money and no connections and no power that you could all of a sudden gather this group of 500,000 people all over the world. And I think that's one of the kind of structural effects of the internet, that it is possible to bring lots of people together in this really powerful way that hasn't existed before for very, very cheap. So, I think I ran MoveOn for 5 years, and it was a really exciting time, and we figured out a lot about how to engage people. And in 2008, I stepped back, and I had always, I never wanted to just kind of be a one project person. And so, I turned over the directorship of MoveOn to someone else. And, during the time I was at MoveOn, I had been very bought into this idea that the internet was sort of inherently going to create a great deal of positive social change, and that, the way that it was structured was going to itself decentralize power and make ordinary people more powerful. And I think there are ways in which that's true. But as I looked around, I thought, okay, we've had the internet now for 10 years, or 14 years at that time. Are regular people more powerful in any real and substantive way or not? And if they're not, why aren't they? And that led me to start thinking about the media, and in particular, how the internet was reshaping what media reaches people. Because, the sort of interesting, weird fact of our time is that it's never been easier to access, foreign media, for example. It's never been easier to get any foreign newspaper that you want to get immediately. But Americans actually aren't better informed about foreign affairs than they were 30 years ago. In fact, by some studies, they're less well informed. So that's really weird, right? This medium that's made it possible for us to be in connection with, the whole world isn't having that effect. And why isn't it having that effect? And that's sort of what I was thinking about when I stumbled across a blog post by Google talking about personalization. And basically they were saying, Google isn't going to be the same for everyone anymore. If you have a certain search history, you might see a different result from someone who has a different search history. And I know lots of folks here have read the book, so I won't go too deep into the filter bubble stuff. But it became very clear that this was a phenomenon that was not only shaping Google, but shaping increasingly almost all of the media that we consume. And I was telling folks earlier, the latest example that I heard about, which is really kind of like a hilariously bad example of this phenomenon, is a new app that you can get on your phone that helps you avoid specific people by giving you alerts when you're near them so that you can go somewhere else. So this is $1 million of investment money went into that, which if any of you can find those investors, I think they'll pretty much put money wherever they into any project. But increasingly this phenomenon of using technology to show people only the content that they want to see based on their personal preferences is becoming baked into every piece of interaction. So Yahoo, the front page, runs 13 million different variations of its front page every day based on who the visitors are who are visiting it. Increasingly, companies like the New York Times and the Washington Post are experimenting with this kind of personalization. And what we've moved from is the thing that we're all kind of familiar with of if you like this product, you'll like that product, to a much more concerning and squishy and complicated set of recommendations where it's, if you like this idea, maybe you'll like that idea. And that's really worrisome because, it's one thing if you get a certain kind of product, but when your media is reflecting back your own prejudices or your own interests in ways that you can't even totally see, it gives you a false view of the world, and that then can shape what you do about it. So, the particular piece of this that I got interested in was looking at Facebook and looking at sort of the way that people are increasingly consuming media, and I was having a conversation with someone who worked at the New York Times and was the front page editor there on the website. And he was saying, when we post stories about Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, people don't click them a whole lot. They don't share them a whole lot. But we post them anyway because we think it's really important for people to know what's going on in this war that American citizens have voted for. And so even though they do poorly by the metrics, it's our civic duty to put them on the front page anyway. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, on the one hand, this is a really noble thing. It's not a good business strategy, but it's something that the Times is doing because it's part of their civic mission. On the other hand, 30% of adults now use Facebook as a service to find their news. And if those stories aren't somehow surfacing to people on Facebook, are they gonna reach people? And as we move from a system of human editors to a system of algorithmic ones, what happens to the content that's important but maybe not as shareable? So I'll talk about Upworthy in a minute, but the takeaway that I had, thinking about the filter bubble, was that it's not inevitable that this kind of technology will introduce us to new ideas, and it's not inevitable that that the web will be a connective medium even, and it all depends on how it's structured, right? how it brings people together. Does it bring people together, or does it actually cocoon us in our, in an enclave just with people who agree with us? And so, again, it's this question of the structure of the system dictates a lot of the behavior in it and dictates what kind of society we are. Are we a society where we have conversations with people who don't think like us, or are we have a society where we have conversations with people who we agree with already? So, all of this thinking, I wrote the book and published it, and it was exciting, and I got invited to come talk to a lot of these tech firms, and that was really interesting. But at the end of the day, I sort of felt like it's only so satisfying to put a critique out there without trying to actually do something about it. And so I started thinking about what I might be able to do to affect this. So, and in particular, this question of like, how do we help these ideas that need to reach a lot of people in order to have a functioning democracy? How do we help that actually happen? How do we help them along? And if the Facebook newsfeed is going to act as this kind of Darwinian filter that good pieces of content and pieces of content about important things have to fight it out with the latest news about Kim Kardashian, how do we help the good stuff win that war? And that's really what led me to start experimenting with online content. I got together with a friend of mine, Peter Keckley, who had been the managing editor at The Onion. And we were thinking about how we could actually present important topics in a way that a lot of people would engage with them, view them, and actually share them. And one of the premises was people actually are very interested in this stuff if you can actually get them to tune in, and if you can convince them that it's not going to be incredibly boring and dry. And I think a lot of people, we've been conditioned a little bit because the important content has its own special space. We've been conditioned to think that there's important content, which is kind of boring but important, and then there's entertaining content, which is fun. And on a newspaper, they literally just have different places that they live, and you get the whole package, and you read both. Now they all have to fight with each other, and it's not a surprise that the important content doesn't do that well naturally, because the people who write it are not expecting that they have to be engaging. So with Upworthy, we said, okay, let's try to find the really engaging bits of content around important topics and help make sure that they reach a large audience. And when we started doing this, we said we were pitching it to people. It's a startup, it's a for-profit company, and people said, well, really the audience isn't there for that. There just isn't a big audience for this kind of stuff, and that's what we've really learned is that the reason the internet isn't creating a new informed public is people don't really want to know. And so we launched Upworthy anyway, and we found some investors who were willing to kind of bet on the idea that people might be interested. And the last 2 years have been amazing because the first month, 1 million people showed up to the website. We thought, okay, this is something. This is starting to demonstrate something. And the second month, 2 million people showed up. And these days, 50 million people come and visit Upworthy every month. And it's a group of people that is a pretty wide spectrum of people from across the society, demographically, politically. We see the demographics, and we can see that this actually is a place where people are coming together to learn about what's going on. So that's been really exciting, and I think demonstrated again that there is this real appetite for content that matters. So in terms of the structure of Upworthy, it's been really interesting to think about that as well, because in media companies, there's a very particular set of ways of organizing a media company that produce very particular outcomes. And in particular, the constant challenge that media companies have is, on the one hand, you want to reach the largest audience possible. That's what drives the revenue. That's what makes the whole thing work. On the other hand, you want to be doing stuff that you're proud of and that you think is important. And kind of a structural tension that exists that I think leads to some bad things happening in media. It leads to, to people chasing audiences with ridiculous stunts and justifying it by saying, somewhere over here is some content that we're genuinely proud of that we published. And so we thought a lot about how do we actually structure this thing so that baked into the structure of the organization is the mission and the ethical process that goes with it. And one of the key takeaways for us was someone said, "You are what you measure." And I thought, okay, this is a really interesting, kind of core idea that structures are built around, are often built around sort of a particular set of incentives. And if you can be conscious about how you create those incentives, you change how people make decisions. So at Upworthy, we decided, rather than have the traffic generating stuff and the stuff we were actually proud of, what if we said, we're going to bar ourselves from doing anything that is just for the purposes of traffic. You get no points for that. And only when you actually, when you draw a lot of attention to something that's meaningful, do you get points as an editor. And, we've worked over the years to refine that metric. How do we actually, sort of assess how mission-y a piece of content is, and how do we assess how many, how much impact it has. But it's really led to this totally different editorial process than if we were just telling people go out and try to get a lot of traffic and try to get a lot of page views. So, to zoom out from these three experiences, my early website experience, the Filter Bubble book, and Upworthy, I think in the early web experience, I kind of came away with this feeling that the structure of the web opens the door to things that weren't possible before and allows people to collaborate in a way that they weren't able to before, and potentially allows for a lot of good to happen. And in the Filter Bubble experience, I realized, but that's actually not inevitable, and it's all about how you bring people together that really matters. And then at Upworthy, it was this experience actually kind of building an organization around a set of metrics in order to achieve that mission and make sure that it's working right. So, the theme here is structures matter a lot, and they have these moral consequences. And as I was doing the research for the book, I came across again, one of the great experiments in the history of psychological experiments. It would now, no university would ever allow it now, but it's called the Milgram experiment. And the Milgram experiment basically had subjects in one room, and they were ostensibly teaching someone in another room how to answer a quiz right. And the idea was that they were supposed to give increasingly severe electric shocks every time someone got the answer wrong. So they weren't actually giving shocks. That was the brilliant design of this thing. They weren't actually doing anything to anyone, but they thought they were. And the knob went from 1 to 10, and 7, 8, 9, and 10, there was a big like skull and crossbones. This is really dangerous. Be careful piece. But there was a doctor standing behind them. And so as the fake subjects got these answers wrong, the doctor would kind of nod and say, okay, go on, deliver the shock, right? And, people would turn it up and turn it up. And the actors that were playing the actual subjects would increasingly kind of shriek and yell and sound in horrible pain. But because, the doctor, the authority figure, was standing behind them saying, go ahead, keep going, people kept turning it up. And they actually, I think it was about 70% of the folks in the experiment turned it up to 10, right? So what do we take away from this? To me, it's a reminder that morality is a very fluid thing, and that even good people in the wrong context can be encouraged to do things. They basically could have been killing someone as far as they knew, but they thought they were in the setting where someone else was sanctioning it, and so they were letting themselves, go along with it. And to me, it's a great reminder that that it's the context around our decisions that's as important as being good people or making good decisions, and that as leaders, and as business creators and as people who are thinking about organizations, that thinking about the context that everyone operates in is as important for being ethical as actually, making ethical decisions yourself. We all have this kind of idea of ethical leaders as people who are sort of great judges, King Solomonic in character and really wise. And I think that's a piece of it, but I actually think ethics is as much about creating a context in which people make ethical decisions and creating structures in which everyone's encouraged to make ethical decisions, as it is, just going through your life trying to be good. A related concept from psychology that I've always really loved is called fundamental attribution error. And fundamental attribution error is the simple idea that we tend to judge other people's flaws we tend to judge as evidence of their character, and our flaws we tend to judge as situational. And so, I was late because I couldn't have predicted there was traffic, and my clock was set wrong. But when someone else is late, it's because they're just lazy, or they're not really on the ball, or they don't really care. And this is something that happens, it's one of the most profound findings of psychology, but it's easy to forget. And it's easy to believe that, we, each of us, are good, and the only thing that matters is actually having a strong character. I think what we've actually learned over the last 50 years of psychological research is, character only gets you so far, and that thinking about the situations that people operate in, really gets you the rest of the way. And so the reason this is especially relevant is because as we move into an increasingly technological age, structures are easier, we're creating these really interesting kinds of structures. And we all have the potential to create these structures. And if we do it right, hundreds of millions of people or billions of people live in them, right? So Facebook is a certain kind of structure. It has a certain kind of embedded ethics. It has certain things that are allowed and not allowed. And it's incredibly powerful. It shapes how people interact in society. One of my favorite Facebook stories is, I was talking to a guy who was on the growth team there. And he said, we would just do the most crazy things to get Facebook to grow when it was a young company. He said, we noticed that if you showed a 30-year-old woman pictures of her female friends, she was more likely to upload a picture of herself. And we noticed that if she uploaded a picture of herself, that her male friends were likely to comment on that picture. And we noticed that if her male friends commented on the picture, they would use Facebook more for the next several months. So what we did was we worked this in reverse. And we looked for men who were not using Facebook as much as we thought they should. And we found their female friends, and we showed them pictures of their female friends so that they would upload a picture of themselves so that the men would comment on it, so that they would use Facebook more. So this is kind of amazing, right? Because this is basically sort of social engineering on a massive scale, simply for the purpose of increasing the number of page views that Facebook is getting over a particular course of time. So these systems have immense power. And one of my favorite sort of principles comes from a guy named Kranzberg. It's Kranzberg's first law. I actually don't know what his other laws are, so if you find out, let me know. But it's technology is neither good nor evil, nor is it neutral. And it's this idea that every system that we create, but especially technological ones, have these valences that bring people together in better ways or in worse ways. We really have to think about what those valences are. Larry Lessig, who's a great theorist of technology, has a similar idea, which he says, there's all sorts of different kinds of regulation of behavior. And in the real world, we're used to there being laws, and then there's behavior, and there's a gap between those two things. So if I want to throw a stone through a glass window, I can do that. I might get arrested, I might get put in jail, but it's something that's possible for me to do. But we increasingly live in these technologically mediated systems where if the designer says you can't throw a rock through a glass window, you can't do it. It's impossible. And so I think we need to be thinking less, we need to be thinking less about law and more about the other kinds of regulation that dictate behavior. And I think the reason, the other reason that this is especially important in the context of business ethics is that the scale of modern businesses, for better and for worse, means that small changes that they make can have really, really dramatic consequences. Larry Page recently said, the co-founder of Google recently said that he would rather leave his money to Elon Musk, to a great entrepreneur, than to a nonprofit. And I think that's kind of, I disagree with that. I won't finish that sentence in case Larry is listening. But I think the truthful part of it is that if you can actually, build things on a scale of a Google, that the amount of impact that has on people's lives is enormous. And that, we want to be building these systems in a way that actually encourages people to do the ethical thing, be paying attention to the things that matter, be interacting with people differently from themselves, and be thinking about moral questions rather than not. So, sort of my three takeaways here are, number one, leadership is really about creating ethical structures as much as it is being ethical yourself. You have to do both. Number two, what you measure matters, and that's part of what pulls structures in certain directions or other directions. And you want to really think carefully as you're building these structures about what you're going to measure. Is the bottom line the only thing that matters, or are there other things that matter? And if so, how do you actually build them in some way where you can't afford to ignore them? And then third, you can do both of those things and still find that there are unforeseen consequences. And so I think it's not enough actually just to set the ball rolling and hope that it rolls in the right direction. You actually have to think, you have to be paying attention constantly to what is the net impact of what I'm doing? And is it positive in the world or is it not? One of the reasons that it's such an honor for me to be here and to be talking to all of you is, I grew up in Maine, and there's something special about coming back here. I really think of it as my home. And a lot of how I think about the world comes from growing up in this very small town in Maine, Lincolnville. And I think, small communities have these kinds of ethical structures baked in. And it's something that we understand as Mainers, that when we see people broken down on the side of the road, we have to stop to help them because, no one else might do that. Or when we see people suffering or suffering from a disease in our communities, we all chip in to raise money because we know we all have to get each other's back. And there's a basic structural conceit that underlies that, which is that you can't hide from folks' humanity. You can't ignore that because it's just too small of a community. You can't abstract it away. It's all right there. And so I think, for the folks here who are entrepreneurs or starting a nonprofit, that's something that you actually sort of have in your repertoire that not everyone does. You understand how these systems can work when they do encourage moral behavior, when they do encourage ethical decision making. And you can bring that into the things that you build, and you can bring that into the organizations that you lead. And hopefully you can use those skills and make the world a better place. So I'm going to answer questions now, but I really appreciate being asked to be here. Thank you.
Please wait till you have a microphone to ask a question.
You were saying before that you were looking at the demographics for Upworthy. How could you see the demographics? I was asking, how do you see the demographics of those who are accessing Upworthy?
So it's a great question, and the answer is that even if you don't collect any data, yourself, there are companies. There's a company called Quantcast, which is installed on a bunch of people's browsers and follows them around as they go online and looks at sort of like the Nielsen set-top box, and it looks at what media sites they're visiting. And so it's companies like Quantcast that give us that information.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I'm going to take the liberty of asking what I asked earlier at lunch, and that is that I thought it would be good to check what Wikipedia has to say about you. And it's a wonderful recitation of your history. And in discussing your book, they give a very graphic example, which brought it home to me really clearly. And it was the BP example, that if you're one kind of person and you Google, I think it was, BP, you get a lot about the oil spill and the corruption of the company and so forth and so on. If you're another kind of person with different politics, you'll get a lot of information about how to invest in BP, et cetera. Will you expand on that a bit?
Well, yeah, that's a pretty good summary. But this is the sort of scary thing that kind of tipped me, sent me down this road, because I was seeing that. I mean, another example was, Googling Egypt around the time of the Arab Spring. And some people saw all of this content around the protests and what was going on there. And other people saw literally like visit the pyramids, which would have been a really weird trip. So, it's this, and who knows, we don't know who Google thinks we are or who Facebook thinks we are. And therefore we don't know how they're responding to that and shaping our media, but clearly there's something that's being reflected back in these search results, and it's happening in a passive way. You don't have to turn it on, and yet it has this big impact in how you see the world.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
When you met with the leaders of Facebook and Google, did you talk with them about the notion of social structures, ethical structures? And then related to that, I'd be curious if you did, 1, 2, how did they respond? And then 3, Facebook's impact on privacy, and how they use all of that information that we've voluntarily given them about ourselves.
Great question. So, and to be clear, I didn't meet with the leaders of these companies. I met with some, middle managers. But I did raise, I did raise all of this. I mean, it was a really frank conversation, and I would say different companies take this stuff to heart differently. I mean, it was sort of part of what made me think about this whole topic for this talk, was watching how different companies situate ethics as something that they care about or they don't care about. And when I went to Google, people there very sincerely engaged, wanted to show me how they were, actually solving this problem already and where they were going with it. And, I wasn't totally convinced, and I'm not totally convinced, but it was clear that it was something that they were actually grappling with and thinking about the social consequences of. And Google News in particular has kind of a unpersonalized piece, which tends to be world news at the top, and then you can kind of do the personalized piece underneath that if you want, and specifically sort of for this purpose, to make sure that people know about the really big important things that they should know about, not just the personalized feed. So that was my experience with Google. When I talked to some of the other companies, it was either more blank stares or more trying to say, one of the most interesting arguments I got into was they would say, oh, it's not, it's just code, it's just math, and it's objectively figuring out what people are interested in, and you can't really argue with it because it's just an equation. And I would say, yeah, but it's an equation that encapsulates an opinion about how the world works. And when Facebook, collects, when Facebook looks at how many likes something has, the word like has a very particular valence, and it's easier to click like on I just ran a marathon than on, war in Darfur enters its 10th year. And so you can't separate that signal. You can't reduce that to a number without understanding what that number means, and it means something in a social context. And therefore, there is no objectivity. These algorithms are opinions that you have about what people should see, and you have to kind of own them as opinions. So, not sure I, won that one, but in different. Sorry. Yeah. Well, yeah. No, it was useful to have the conversation. I think, again, different companies have different levels of concern when it comes to the data. I think, Facebook was always one that struck me as not having a particularly thoughtful kind of theory of the case. Starting from when Mark Zuckerberg said, everyone just has one identity, and so Facebook encourages you just to have one identity. You're the same person with your friends and your colleagues and your whatever. And, very obviously that's not really true. People behave very differently in different contexts. They speak differently, they act differently, and it's part of why we're actually seeing that there are different social networks. There's LinkedIn for people to be their business self, and messaging apps where people are their playful self, and different kinds of contexts. So, I don't know that there's a grand unified theory of. I don't think Facebook is saying we want the world to be this particular way and driving toward it. I think they're mostly just building their business, doing things that are interesting, and hoping that the consequences are good. Yeah.
I guess I worry more about the data that Google's collecting than Facebook, because at least with Facebook, you volunteer that information. You don't have to participate in Facebook. Whereas, do you think Google operates with any sort of ethical framework? Because it seems to me that they're always flirting on the edge of privacy invasions, and whether it's taking pictures of people's homes with Google Maps, or whether it's mining data out of people's emails, which I think now is the subject of a lawsuit in California. They're to me, they're sort of the 800-pound gorilla that is pretty dangerous with respect to, we worry about the NSA, but I worry a lot more about Google's. I think they're probably a little more finer in terms of how they figure out what I'm thinking, or they think what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Luckily they're integrated now, so you can worry about them both together. But I think it's a dangerous thing wherever it lives in a way, because, I mean, so Facebook has more data than you might realize, because every page that you visit with a little Facebook widget on it is a page that Facebook can know that you personally visited, which is not something that I ever thought of as I surfed my way around the web. That Facebook was getting a pretty complete web history from me. I think this data creates, is a source of a great deal of power, and we know power tends to be corrupting and tends to be, eventually used for the wrong reasons. I think it's part of the reason that I think, one of the best solutions to all of this would be simply to allow people to pull their data out of, pull any data that they personally volunteered to a system out of it. And that's not my original idea. That comes from a venture capitalist named Brad Burnham. But I think, if we could easily decide we're going to take all of the data that we've built up in Facebook and pull it into another medium that treats our privacy more carefully, it would create a kind of liquidity that doesn't exist right now, and make it much more possible for people to check the power of these incumbents. And to me, that's kind of structurally a much better solution, and a very reasonable one, because who can argue with people being able to get back the data that they personally volunteered about themselves? I mean, Facebook and Google can, but besides them.
So, hi, over here. Hi.
Hey.
So going off on the Facebook meme for a second, I read an article recently, and I want to say it involved Upworthy, but it certainly was an organization like Upworthy, and concerns that were being raised by organizations like yours that over time, at one point last year, being able to record really record sort of viral hits off of various timelines, and that behind the scenes Facebook is tweaking and monetizing that effort, and that is impacting and suppressing and raising other people somewhat artificially. And I'm curious, in a world where those things are, so looking at someone like Google, who seems to be kind of doing it more in the abstract, Facebook, which seems very purposeful in that effort, how do organizations like Upworthy deal with that? How do we trust our content that it has real viral worth, and it's not simply, who's paying the most for a hit?
It's a great question, and definitely one of the sort of, if you're a media organization, you think a lot about this, because we used to think about media consolidation and media control as an issue that was mainly about sort of who owns the printing press or who owns the TV antenna. Now it's who owns the social network that all of this happens in. But it's the same kind of it's the same kind of power. It's a gatekeeper, and those gatekeepers, the new gatekeepers, the Facebooks, have just as much power in a lot of ways as the old ones did. I think for us, we think a lot about how do we integrate what we're doing. How do we align what we're doing with where Facebook wants to go in a way that preserves our mission, but also looks algorithmically or metrically like a good piece of content? So, when we think about it, we think about if you're Facebook, you really want to keep people engaged, and how do we serve content that both highlights an important topic and hits all of the marks that Facebook wants it to hit in terms of keeping people engaged? We might wish that we could do other kinds of content, and we do, but I think, from a media standpoint, you have to think that way right now, because people spend 2 minutes out of every month on Twitter, and less on a lot of other platforms, and 7 hours a month on Facebook. So Facebook is it is the place where traffic comes from more than anywhere else these days. But I think, if you're thinking about this systemically, you think, boy, it would be good if there were a lot of these places rather than a few really big companies that you have to sort of follow their rules or perish with. And I think for people who are coders or who are thinking about kind of getting into the internet space, I think it's still possible. It's still possible to come in and develop something that then gets really big and does have these different valences. And I think that's a really important thing to do right now to help figure out what the alternatives to Facebook are going to be, or what the other pieces of that ecosystem are going to be, so that no one company has the ability to dictate what millions of people see.
Two questions. One, what does Upworthy do to present both the conservative side and the liberal side for its readers? And then secondly, what do you personally do to protect data about yourself?
So I should say, Upworthy was created to solve one piece of the filter bubble problem, which is, are people talking about public topics that matter, or are they talking about, reality TV? I don't think we didn't create it especially with the goal of being ideologically, perfectly balanced. It's not intended to be objective. It's intended to start conversations that can happen across an ideologically broad spectrum. And one of the things that I'm the most excited about is that when you look at what percentage of Facebook are friends with people who like Upworthy, it's about 80%. So it gets you, into a really broad set of the public and not just any one ideological camp. To me, when I see conservatives taking some of the same approaches and starting to build content about the topics that they care about, that then surfaces in the news feed, that makes me happy too, because it's bringing together this cultural conversation that has gotten very, very polarized. What I do to protect my own privacy, I'm not especially good at it, but I think it's really a matter of knowing, of understanding these media. I think, and knowing when you want personalization to be baked in and when you don't, and what is likely to be personalized and what is not. So there are totally times when I'm Googling something and I open an incognito window in my browser, which means, it doesn't come with all of my personal data, to Google something because I want to see what everyone's seeing. And then there are times when I'm trying to find a sandwich shop that I've ordered from a bunch of times before, where the personalization is actually helpful. I think the key is actually understanding what the lens is that you're looking through, and is it an accurate one or is it inaccurate, and if it's inaccurate, how is it inaccurate, so that you can then make informed choices about how you use those tools. So that's, for me, that's more important than protecting my information per se.
From your perspective, where I'm sure you have fascinating conversations and you're involved with people who are thinking these things through, what's your crystal ball look like in terms of the whole marriage of technology, information, the way people live? You commented about back in the day when we checked our email every few days. It's astounding, the change. And I sometimes look ahead, and I can't even get my mind around it in 10 years. What does 10 years or 50 years look like to you in terms of how we will live and how this will drive human beings?
It's a really, really hard question. And I can't say I have a single, clear picture that I would, put a lot of money behind, or a big bet behind. I think, I'm always torn, because I think, the pessimistic view is that technology allows us a great concentration of power and a great and basically what you end up with in a few years, and we're already kind of seeing the emergence of this world, is, there's Facebook and Google and, and Amazon and Apple, and let's say one of them merges with Comcast. Now all of a sudden you've got a, internet provider NBC Universal, a media company, and Facebook, Google, whatever, all under the same roof. And you start to build these, basically sort of walled vertical universes that are very, very hard to escape. So in that context, you essentially have new monopolies that people live in that you can't get easily from one to the other, because the more that you do in Facebook land, the harder it is to all of your data, all of your friends live in Facebook land, and it's very hard to bring them over to Google land. That's the pessimistic version. I tend to be an optimist, and I tend to think that when people are aware of these kinds of problems, and when smart, creative minds are unleashed against them, that those kinds of things aren't actually inevitable. And so the hopeful view is that we've had this first couple of generations of technology that's really been about just building businesses, building audiences, but then increasingly, the brightest minds and the next Mark Zuckerbergs are thinking about, how do you use this technology to bring people together in socially beneficial ways, in ways that actually solve some of our big social problems. And I think, we're seeing some of that, and I think we could see a lot more of that, and actually find that this stuff, counters some of the really concerning trends in income inequality or environmental degradation that we see right now. So to me, it's all, it's not a foregone conclusion either way, and I wouldn't bet on one of those futures or the others. But part of the reason that I wrote the book and that I do the work that I do is to try to encourage as many people as possible to get in there and help create these structures, because I think that's the only way that it turns out well.
Eli,
Yeah.
in parting and thanks, I wanted to read from your Twitter feed, which I was following during the talk.
Uh-oh.
And Aaron Nadeau noted, is Aaron here? Says, packed house at UNE for the lecture by Upworthy co-founder Eli Parzer. Thank you very much for coming. And then right above that, she sends a message to Rich Brooks that says, you should consider Eli for Agents of Change in 2014. So you're being tracked.
Oh, excellent. Good to know.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you all.